Welcome to the Intrazone, a show about the SharePoint Intelligent Intranet. I'm Mark Cashman, here with Chris McNulty, and we are here to get ECM-ified.
But today we're focusing on content services. The artist formerly known as Enterprise Content Management.
I have thought about moving into the 21st century. Absolutely. ECM, if for those folks that have been around for a while, Enterprise Content Management, definitely has grown up and aged into a beautiful content services offering.
Yeah, it's content services for everyone. On today's episode, we're going to get to talk to a broad range of folks, left to right, from inside Microsoft and beyond, about what content services mean to organizations today.
That's right. We have guests. The first one that we talk with is Ian Story. He's a principal program manager for SharePoint and OneDrive. That's inside. Then you talk to panelists from the AIIM Content Service Forum, John Mancini and Cheryl McKinnon. And we'll also talk to our ecosystem guests, Erica Tolley and Anthony Woodward of RecordPoint.
The thing about today's topic is content services as an industry has been moving towards an understanding that the same disciplines and the same structures that you would use to manage content for the final years of its life, to make sure it's in the right vault and make sure it's locked down and it's there as a permanent record. When you bring that in the cloud and you bring cloud power and machine learning along it, you can start to see some of the same structures driving collaboration and creation of content instead of just how do I capture it at the end of its life. When we talk to our guests today, we're going to hear a lot about the capacity and the power of Office 365 and what some of the opportunities are for compliance and IT to set up rigorous patterns for how you make sure that information is locked down. But I think it's really important to look at it also from the perspective of you, our listener, who may just have a single site and you're trying to be as productive as you can inside of that site. And there's a lot of capability that we've introduced just in the past few years alone that are relevant for you.
Yeah, and it can all start with when you go to create a site. You know, one of the options that you're now presented with is how do you classify this site? How open is it? Is it locked down? Should it be available to external users or not? Some of that will be dictated by IT, but really they're putting forth what kind of site are you creating? What kind of project do you have? And what kind of people are going to get involved? Which then will set up the site for you to a certain degree. If it's very open, it might just be a very open site. But if it starts to get to the point of, well, then you're going to have a lot of content in here that's described in a certain way. You want to share it in a certain way. You want to include other people in a certain way or at a point in time. And there's a lot that you can do to configure that site, the pages, the lists, the libraries, in a way that makes sense to your project or your sets of projects, which may or may not be the same.
In Office 365, we have a maximum capacity of about 30 trillion documents. And that kind of scale, to be fair, we don't have any customers who are in the trillions yet. We do have customers in the billions. There obviously is a need for IT and a top level of the organization. How do I manage billions of documents? Bringing it down to the team site level, you could still have 10 million documents in your library. And so one of the things that we've introduced finally gives you the ability to manage a single library at scale with attention views.
Yeah, so attention views certainly will just raise a notion of, hey, you're missing something. And that's usually going to be something that's missing that's going to make it valuable or easier for the next person. So if there's a field that you fill out that basically says status, ready to share, status internal only, if that's not filled out, people can't tell, well, what stage is this thing at? But it's an easy piece of metadata. It's something that you could put through a review and approval, and based on somebody's approval, make sure that status gets updated. But if it's missing, it just adds an element of, I wonder what I can or can't do with this. And at the same time, it's super easy to do. You don't have to wait for IT. You don't have to wait for any custom development. And that's true for review and approval scenarios. That's true for beyond files, how you manage your pages and your sites. Are they ready to be shared and searchable and viewable? If not, there's a couple of things before they are ready that you can manage so that it's a much better experience. It's known as you're leading up to that. And then once they're available, it's easier for people to consume.
So here in the dead of winter in Seattle, now that we're through the holidays, I'm very happy to be able to talk about another scaling thing that's coming out soon. We talked about it at Ignite, but it's document sets. And we've had document sets in the on-premises and classic mode. We're finally bringing document sets forward into modern, and it gives you a way of being able to also group and bind related documents into a common entity that can share metadata. You can route them the same ways that you would route a single file. I remember there was a day last month and I was writing the blog post about page approvals. And I was looking at all the things that we have inside of the platform, and I'm like, we've really come far from where it was, say, 5 years ago in terms of, yes, no, this is approved and published, but being able to create structured processes and templates along with all the richness that we're getting through the modern experience.
So there is a lot that the end user can do to support what it is their part of the business focuses on. You create your own site, you manage your own files, you put them out into the rest of the internet in a way that's meaningful, easy to use, easy to consume, easy to search and find. But really, leading into the rest of the episode, we'll focus on beyond the individual.
So no matter where you're plugging into content services, as a user, as IT, as compliance, we have something in today's podcast for you. Let's have a listen. So up next, we're joined by Ian Story, the Principal Program Manager on the OneDrive and SharePoint team. Ian, welcome. Thanks for sitting down with us.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Great to be here.
Ian, obviously you and I have worked together a lot over the past couple of years as we've been rolling content services forward. But I think it probably is a great place to talk about your journey and how you got to Microsoft. Going back in your career, you start with Weyerhaeuser, like a tree and lumber company where paper begins. And you can kind of follow that paper trail on through IBM and through financial services all the way into Microsoft, I would think. Can't you?
Yep, absolutely. So it's funny that you call it a paper trail because literally at Weyerhaeuser, that's what Weyerhaeuser did when I joined. We were a giant paper company, 70,000 employees, everything you could make from a tree, whether it was paper or houses or wood or what have you. Started making paper, went to a financial services firm, Washington Mutual, big American bank, later acquired by JP Morgan Chase. There we used a lot of paper, and then from there went to IBM, and at IBM we tried to get rid of paper, so getting people to digitize that paper and so forth, put it into the system. And now here at Microsoft, hopefully everybody's using a Power App and so forth, and they don't need paper at all.
Right.
So kind of the journey there over the last 20 or so years.
When we think about the last few years, the last couple decades, and kind of the rise of ECM, I mean, ECM is essential to some of those business operations at those financial firms you talked about.
Yep, absolutely. So, at both WAMU and JP Morgan, we had billions and billions of documents, checks, mortgages, credit card statements, bank statements, you name it. Any type of paper that supported a transaction, really, it was all kept. Even after it was digitized, it was still all kept. Predominantly, in some cases, there was some shredding that would happen.
Sure.
But predominantly, it was all kept. Paper still drives that business today. You see some of the upstarts that are trying to change that, but you look at any of the major financial institutions, they're still driving paper through the back-end processes, and thus ECM really driving a lot of change in that in those organizations.
I know when we think about content services, the way we talk about it and where we're kind of springboarding from some of the analyst things that, content is the oil of the 21st century. Which I don't love that metaphor. Do you?
No, not at all. Oil sounds like the 20th century.
Right.
It's calling, right? We like something a little more organic, renewable, that type of a concept. Oil is, burning dead dinosaurs is not really what we're trying to do here in the ECM or content services world today.
But if you look back 10 or 20 years, there's definitely a way that an organization can get competitive advantage by how they embrace their content, and probably conversely, if you're not knowing what's happening with your content, you can be at a disadvantage.
I'll tell you a couple quick stories. So at Weyerhaeuser, one of the most stressful jobs of my life, they had printed manuals that would go by every piece of equipment. And those manuals were, out of date almost from the moment they were printed. And so the purpose of the content services system was to make sure that you had the correct document on how to start the machine up or shut the machine down. And if you didn't, someone could lose their lives. Someone could get really injured or something. Same thing back to financial services. Obviously we're not talking about generally life or death situations, but you don't want to mess up somebody's mortgage. You don't want to screw up their bank account. You don't want to mess up their credit card and so forth. So you think about all the real business use cases there in that world. It's really important, right? What happens to the paper and what happens ultimately to getting rid of the paper and how you replace it with something hopefully more reliable and more productive.
I know from talking to some of our customers that are out there in the market who are in the furniture business, how they find their drafts of those pictographic manuals that you use to assemble furniture on your own becomes really important when it's 2 years and they need to revise it, and making sure that it didn't disappear into a contractor OneDrive, never to be seen again.
Yep, exactly. And, that's incredibly important also when you think about other concepts in content services around compound documents, meaning putting those documents together, because typically a manual for even a piece of furniture is made up of several smaller documents where you put those all together in like a document set in our world. And so having those, being able to look back to what version, who did it, who worked on it, what piece of furniture that equates to, and so forth, and being able to keep that whole life cycle of the content is incredibly important in those spaces.
And I know you've been driving this mission, this paper trail forward through IBM to bring you to Microsoft. Can you talk a little about how you got to Microsoft and what your role is here?
Yep. So my role on our leadership team for OneDrive and SharePoint is really around how we engage with customers and partners and even some analyst relations work. But predominantly customers, and working with customers is we talk about how they can move from legacy content services systems and even consumer level sync and share tools to the Microsoft cloud, including, of course, SharePoint and OneDrive.
So the last few years, especially with the rise of content in the cloud, we've looked at some different ways to describe this whole journey. ECM, going back, I'm going to read you a formal definition of ECM. Enterprise content management is a systematic collection and organization of information used by an audience, including business execs, customers, etc. Neither a single technology, nor a methodology, nor a process. A dynamic combination of strategies, methods, and tools to capture, manage, store, preserve, and deliver information, supporting processes throughout the lifecycle.
So dynamic.
Yes. But of late, we've been talking about content services. Mm-hmm. So what is content services? Is it something, when you talk to the ECM nuts of this world, no pun intended, is content services just a new name for the same thing we've always been doing, or are we trying to do something?
Yeah, so you think back maybe a decade or more, the ECM packages on the market were typically suites or a large monolithic deployment from a particular vendor where you would get everything from the repository to the workflow to the capture tool, the records management, and so forth, all in one kind of package. And I think what you've seen Gartner and before that Forrester really recognize as they started talking about content services, whether it's business content services or transactional content services or just regular old content services, is that the world wasn't just a single vendor, and you had lots of folks that were taking capture from one organization or one vendor and workflow from another and the repository from another and so forth. And then when the cloud comes, of course, now you've got people maybe with some on-prem technology that they're using for capture, and they're putting all their content into the cloud, doing workflow there and so forth. And so I'd say that content services really is the recognition by the industry as a whole that it's not just these big monolithic packages anymore, that it's now broken out into a bunch of services that you can use, from workflow and records management to classification and even some of the AI and ML technologies now that we have, all of that going together with the repository and so forth that you traditionally would think of as a quote-unquote ECM or content services system.
One thing I think that's fascinating about your role is part of it is working closely with some of our most strategic customers to get them onboarded into our service. Some from competing platforms, some from our biggest competition out there, SharePoint 2010 sitting under someone's desk.
Yep.
Combined with your role on our engineering teams, looking at what we have and what's coming and trying to bridge that gap for those customers. Mm-hmm. But since we have you here today, and we know that the Intrazone audience is dying to know these things, what, if you think about it from a couple of the different audiences that we have, from a user perspective, what are we doing in content services? What have we released that they really should pay attention to?
Yeah, so I would say, we've really focused a lot on modernizing what we've had in SharePoint and also in OneDrive over the years, right? So when you think back to, you mentioned our largest perhaps competitor, you can think of it that way, in the on-prem install base that we'd like to get moved to the cloud for a variety of benefits. And there's a lot of capabilities that were just kind of not modern, and we've really worked hard to modernize all of the different things related to even, basic things like metadata and so forth, to much more important things like how we share content and so forth through OneDrive. So modernizing that work and really trying to take, it's a overused term, but trying to take this kind of high-end concept of ECM or content services and democratizing it down to regular business users with a tool like OneDrive, where they can have all their content, easily share it, easy easily collaborate on it and still graduate that content into a long-term repository and so forth, like with SharePoint.
One thing I think that's been great that we've done, thinking about Eugene Lin's team in particular, is creating this modernized but unified sharing experience.
Yep.
So that once I have my content in OneDrive or in SharePoint, and it's time to take it and bring it to someone, whether I'm on my web client or I'm inside of Word or I'm inside of SharePoint.
Or on iOS or Android or, even the work that we're doing with other endpoints, the Outlook team and so forth, having that consistent sharing experience, even on the desktop. So just in the sync client on either Windows or Mac, you've got this great consistent experience. And that's really what we're trying to do to make, again, this stuff a lot easier for folks, is to make it consistent. So I don't have to learn a new way to share a document because I'm in Word and I've got some horrible plugin or add-in installed. It's just built into Word. And I don't have to learn a different way to share when I'm in the web and a different way to share on mobile and a different way to share on my desktop. All the same. Yep.
So let's look at it from a little broader perspective. You're a content owner. You own a process, say that you work in marketing campaign management, or you're an accounting director and you have lots of files across a team. What have we been doing that you think is important for them to pay attention to?
Definitely the work that we've done with integrating SharePoint with Teams is incredibly important when we think about how organizations work together, how teams of people work together. So having that same set of capabilities inside of Teams that we provide in SharePoint. Tons of work that we've done, think about what we've done with Microsoft Word recently, right? Where we've got the info pane back in Word with all your metadata and so forth from SharePoint in there. Think about the kind of attention views capability that we've brought to SharePoint, where when you've got documents that need attention, like maybe they're missing required metadata or something like that, we surface that for you. Also, just think about some of the scalability things. I know we'll talk about that in a moment here about just some of the improvements that we've made there. Really significant work.
So let's talk about that now.
Yep.
What are some of those?
Yeah, so I'd say when I talk to customers, the number one thing that they ask me is, hey, we have to use vendor X because SharePoint doesn't really scale the way that we need it to for our major enterprise needs. And what we see, frankly, is they're looking at it from the perspective of what they had with SharePoint 2007 or SharePoint 2010, where they'd put more than a few thousand items in a document library, and then they would have some perf considerations, and they'd be scaling out their SharePoint environment and so forth on-prem. And so I think a lot of folks don't realize that SharePoint Online, SharePoint is part of Office 365, part of Microsoft 365, has significantly changed that game. And it's no longer that consideration anymore where, oh, hey, I've got millions of documents and, oh, that means I need to go get vendor X because Microsoft can't do that with SharePoint. That is definitely not the case. Millions of documents, billions of documents, I think theoretically even trillions of documents, you and I talk about quite a lot, absolutely can be stored in Office 365 with SharePoint under the covers.
And also, storing, sharing, working with the documents, those are definitely some of the business drivers around there. But there's a whole different constituency. I know when we go to some of the conferences, the folks who are librarians and records managers, compliance officers, and so forth, what do you think that we've done that you'd really like them to pay attention to?
Yeah, so all the work that our information protection team has done in really just simplifying and, again, modernizing the way that you do records management, e-discovery, legal hold, all those different things, and doing those across the Microsoft platform, right? So one of the things that, again, I talk about frequently with clients is you've got all this content. You've got email, you've got instant messages, you've got, kind of collaborative content, you've got traditional enterprise content, content services content. And if you've got a bunch of different systems to manage that, now you're doing records management and retention and e-discovery and legal holds in system A and B and C and D and on and on and on. If you move all that to Office 365, you've got one place to manage all that. And that's so important, especially when you start talking about doing things like e-discovery. The costs of e-discovery are huge, tens of thousands of dollars per gigabyte of e-discovery material that you actually produce. So doing that in one system as opposed to having to go to 5 different sources to do that e-discovery is just a huge, huge benefit.
Well, I think especially when you look at the capacity of Teams, beyond just what we were doing with traditional Office, to be able to generate tons more conversation and documentary materials that come in, I think you can be safe with teams when you've got that kind of back end.
Yep, exactly. And that's probably a major differentiator. That's definitely a major differentiator between Teams and some of the competitors out there, is that you have, by default, built into Teams, all of the documents for your conversation with your team end up in SharePoint, and all the ones for individual conversations end up in OneDrive. There for you, backed up, sync, share, all the great things that you need to do, plus all the compliance pieces that you need to have so that all those conversations that you've had and so forth can be discovered. The content that goes with them can be discovered. It can be managed as records and classified and so forth.
And you mentioned Teams, and since my colleague Mark isn't here to stop me, it's time for Sports Talk with Chris and Ian. So, should the Dodgers re-sign Machado?
No. Machado, unfortunately, did not produce the way that he should have produced, except in, maybe controversy. Otherwise, he wasn't that productive. So, no, Dodgers are happy with Kershaw. Corey Seager's coming back from the injury. It'll be all good.
So, beyond Microsoft, I know you have a new role that you're stepping into January 1st as chairman of AIIM.
Yep.
What is AIIM?
AIIM is the Association for Intelligent Information Management. Started in 1943 as the National Micrographics Association, a very long-term organization that's really about bringing the users and the people who actually care, the practitioners for content services, ECM, capture, all these different technologies we've been talking about, bringing them together along with people in the industry that are on the vendor side. And it's almost like a lobbyist organization in some ways, kind of advocating for the good of the industry with all the different vendors and all the different users and practitioners from the different technology stacks all working together. And it's been doing that for over 75 years now. So it's really an honor to be the incoming chairman for AIIM. Obviously,
Microsoft, maybe it's not obvious, but we're a member of AIIM ourselves, and we go to Leadership Council meetings and get to participate in the think tanks. But AIIM is...
And of course, the actual, major shows and so forth sponsor lots of events with AIIM and so forth. Yep.
I also think it's important for our audience to know that AIIM runs lots of local chapters. Mm-hmm. So regardless of coming to these giant global events, there's a place for people working with content to learn more.
Yeah, for sure. And you should go to AIIM.org, AIIM.org, and you can find out about chapters locally and so forth. Lots of just great opportunities to meet with other folks in the industry that maybe aren't working on SharePoint and OneDrive and the Microsoft stack, but are using one of the legacy ECM providers or are trying to learn about file sync and share and so forth. And just a great place to network and work with them and learn from each other. And, at the same time, maybe put a little pitch in on how great SharePoint and OneDrive are.
And if someone wants to do more than just a local chapter, there's an opportunity coming up in March for people to suffer through the weather of San Diego in March. Is that correct?
Yep, correct. So the annual conference for AIIM is in San Diego this March. You and I will be there, and really looking forward to hopefully meeting a lot more of the folks that listen to the podcast there. Let's do a podcast at the conference maybe.
So Ian, great discussion today. Where can our listeners go to learn more about you and what Microsoft is doing with content services?
Yeah, I would say there's one place that everyone needs to memorize, and that is aka.ms/SharePoint-content services.
So, Ian, thanks a lot for sitting down with us today, and hope you can stick around for later in the broadcast when we go through our FAQs.
Yep, great. Thanks, Chris.
Ian, welcome back. Earlier this year, you and I sat down with John Mancini at AIIM and Cheryl McKinnon at Forrester to look at content services in a roundtable, to explore not just the technology that we're bringing forward, but the broader context of what's happening in the industry and some thought leadership. Mm-hmm. So really appreciate your willingness to sit down with us today, and let's take a listen to what the four of us talked about in Baltimore. I'm Chris McNulty, Senior Product Manager for SharePoint and OneDrive at Microsoft. Over the past decade, as part of digital transformation, organizations have increasingly turned to the cloud to help manage their burgeoning arsenal of digital content. Content has always been king, but as we've seen organizations move from petabytes to zettabytes and beyond, struggling with this is expected to be a challenge for years to come. However, many organizations have learned greatly from patterns of the past. That's why today Microsoft is joined by three visionaries from the world of content. Today, we have John Mancini, Chairman Emeritus of AIIM, Cheryl McKinnon, Principal Analyst at Forrester Research, and Ian Story, Principal Program Manager for Microsoft. So John, welcome.
Good to be here, Chris.
Tell me a little about how you got started in this wonderful world of content.
I started with AIIM about 25 years ago, and the focus then was on documents and workflow. And so we migrated the organization to focus more on web-based technologies, and now increasingly on more technologies focused on what we call intelligent information management. So it's been a long journey, a lot of changes, but at the core has always been people, process, and technology.
So Cheryl, you're a Principal Analyst at Forrester Research.
I am.
How did you come to be part of this wonderful world of content?
Well, I actually started as a history major. I didn't come from a technology background.
Interesting.
And I started to realize through a series of summer jobs doing my master's that the world was going digital. So I kind of pivoted into the technology world just to understand how we're going to be able to preserve and protect a lot of our digital heritage.
So Ian, as Principal Program Manager at Microsoft, although I'm not sure everyone understands what that means in your day-to-day.
Sure. So I sit on the leadership team for SharePoint and OneDrive, and I have three primary functions. The first is working with customers. Second is working with partners. Third is working with analysts. And in my spare time, I'm also Microsoft's representative on the AIIM Board of Directors.
So we talked about enterprise content management, ECM, and that's traditionally the name given to this discipline. But increasingly, we've seen the rise of other terminology, intelligent information management, content services. What do we think is going on there? Is this just a new name for the same process, or is there something really transformative going on?
Well, I think there's something really transformative going on here. I think when you go back to ECM, it was really conceived in the era in which people were trying to automate very specific document-intensive, very complicated processes. And that worked well in that environment. Things like new drug application processes and insurance claim processing and things like that. I would never think of it as a market segment. I would think of it as a description of things that people are trying to do with content and information.
So I think regardless of whether we're talking about this as a process or as a tool set or as an end result, I think we all agree we're talking about content here. But what's interesting is I think there's also been an evolution in what is content and what is not.
That's a good question. It used to be easy. It used to be that content was the unstructured documents that were kind of in contrast to more structured data that was held in rows and columns of a database. And now two things have occurred. One is that all those lines that existed between structured and unstructured content, if they ever really meant anything to users, are all blurred, and nobody really cares what the difference is. And the kinds of content isn't just document anymore. And it's not just Office files anymore. It can be video, it can be audio, it can be all sorts of different things. And so it has gotten to be, I think actually information that encompasses both data and content is probably a better description of what we're talking about.
Cheryl, do you think the document is still going to be as prevalent a format in 20 years?
I think the document will be a prevalent format, but I think the equivalent of a document equals a file is the part that is starting to erode as we see a lot more of the online and software as a service authoring tools, things that allow a lot of collaboration and co-creation activities. I mean, these aren't often files until we choose to export them.
Cheryl, do you think in 10 years organizations will have more or fewer repositories than they have now?
So, I actually wrote a little bit last year about, are we shifting to this, post-repository world where the repository becomes less and less, the value add of a content management platform. And what's really important is, do we have the connectivity to federate or interoperate so we can pull content from multiple systems, but hide the complexity from the day-to-day information worker and just present what they need to complete a task, through their mobile app or through an alternative line of business application or in their office productivity tool of choice.
So we know being in the cloud has been a trend for years. In Office 365 alone, Microsoft has over 400,000 customers who are using it. Is the cloud truly transformative, or is it just another data center?
When we used to survey people 3-4 years ago, and particularly an AIIM audience, which is very focused on control and access to content and information and records,
right.
And we would ask them whether the cloud was part of their strategy, people wouldn't just say no, they would say hell no. And when we look at it now, 82% say when they look at the primary direction of their efforts in the next 2 years. 82% say it's in the direction of either the cloud or a hybrid cloud on-prem strategy.
Don't you find there are also some organizations who try to do exactly the same things in the cloud that they were doing on premises, who'd say the cloud is a big enough change?
I think really what's going on is that people want choice. Even organizations that tend to be biased towards an on-prem approach, they want to have that as an option out there. So having both sets of capabilities, I think, becomes really, really critical moving forward.
So both sets.
Yeah.
Cheryl, do you agree?
I do, actually, and we've got data that shows that the tipping point in terms of having most enterprise content management deployments on premises has now shifted to more hybrid and hosted, moving towards software as a service. So I think this hybrid world is where we're going to be living for the next few years as organizations are at different stages of a roadmap to cloud.
So Ian, have you run across any customers who aren't trying hard enough in the cloud, I guess I'd say?
I'd say from a content management point of view, most of our customers are either in the cloud or moving toward the cloud aggressively. But to Cheryl's point, there are a lot of other systems that they have, their ERP systems and CRM systems and, custom things that they've built in their organizations and so forth that are on-prem and will be on-prem for a long time. And they're struggling with how to move those to the cloud as well. The other thing I would say is the customers that have really heavily customized their on-prem deployments of content management tools, ripped out the code that was provided by the vendor and written their own code, their own UIs, their own integration points and so forth. They tend to struggle the most because, oftentimes moving to the cloud, you can't necessarily change all the code that's in the SaaS offering that's provided by the vendor.
So we're talking about some, fear and reluctance, or even fear and loathing about the cloud. But with that, I think there still are legitimate reasons why organizations need to keep some of their uses and some of their content on premises. What are some of the good ones that each of you have heard?
When I talk to some public sector, government agencies and highly regulated agencies, especially, if we look into Europe, for example, if they don't have the confidence that they've got a local vendor that can provide, in-country data residency requirements for sensitive information, then they'll often choose to stay on premises until they have that comfort.
The security kinds of things that Cheryl talked about, and particularly the data residency side, as that gets more and more complex over time and as geographies step in to, put their brand on where they want data to be, that becomes another issue why some people say, well, in this case, we'll keep it on-prem.
So GDPR has recently gone into effect in the European Union. And it reminds me in many regards of some of the focus nearly 20 years ago on Y2K, that there's both risk and opportunity with something like GDPR. Cheryl, what do you see as some of the advantages to the organization of having to comply with GDPR?
Well, I think first off, it kind of compels organizations to really understand their end-to-end content and data holdings. Build out that map so they know where any kind of risky content might reside or any other, employee or customer confidential information. Where does it actually reside? And can we retrieve it, secure it, and potentially even destroy or disclose it, depending on the requests?
And it's not an insignificant undertaking at scale. The survey that I did, basically people came back and said, on average, they thought it would cost €4,800 to find all the information about a customer and deliver it in machine-readable format back to that customer. Well, you start multiplying that times the number of requests that people are going to get, and it really puts an incentive on people to get serious about how they manage their information.
When you look at the industry, certainly Microsoft is not alone in using AI and cognitive services to help enrich the entire part of the content experience. Do we think that this is going to become something that is not just prevalent, but pervasive and noticeable, or something that becomes a background service that we just take for granted, like printing?
Even though it seems like we've been doing it forever, when it comes to sub-processes, is really in its very early stages.
Right.
And I think automation and artificial intelligence is going to pave the way for that and make those engines much more powerful in the future. And
I think we also are going to bump up against, some of the contradictions in terms of how we have managed information over the last couple of decades. I mean, for organizations with very aggressive retention and disposal policies from a records management perspective, they're missing huge swaths of what could be potential useful signals and sources to be mined as part of this. So you're just keeping kind of a small subset of the records because it's less expensive to do e-discovery. You're also missing a big chunk of your corporate memory that could actually contribute to some of the findings and analysis. And think about organizations with still large paper stores. If you can go back 10 years in terms of digital contracts for your customers, great. Well, what if you can go back 50? Because you've actually been able to digitize and extract information that can lead to more intelligent decisions going back over longer periods of time because you've done that conversion.
So compliance and records management and retention have long been, pillars of how we manage information at scale, on premises or in the cloud. How do you see that as a discipline evolving over the next 10 years?
Well, I think that there's a lot of opportunity as we just talked about moving into, more of using the algorithms, understanding what is the right kind of algorithm to do different kinds of categorization, classification. I think that these roles, because they're often subject matter experts in their particular lines of businesses, they understand the corporate taxonomy, how they've been using things like metadata, could be in a very good position to be, kind of the trainers of the algorithms going forward, rather than just the retainers of the records.
So if you think about what's going on now with cloud content management as a second wave or a second opportunity for records management, how do we as practitioners and how does the industry as a whole make sure that we don't repeat the risk that our records archives become the warehouse where documents go to die?
I think one of the challenges that we at AIIM have is, okay, how do you take a lot of those practices that were traditionally defined in an on-prem world and migrate those into a cloud environment so that people don't make the same mistakes they made the first time? Because you're right. We've all seen cloud implementations that turned into just glorified instances of the file share. It's just a horrible dumping ground of junk. And that's not where you really want to get to.
I think that, we didn't quite get there in the on-premises world because it was too expensive to go back and index the billions and tens of billions and hundreds of billions of documents that I had. I didn't have the compute capacity to do that and so forth. I think the cloud will open that door up with the scalability and the compute capacity that you have in the cloud.
And I think it also opens the door, in addition to all of the scale performance advantages, especially at large scale, the ability to have that information more broadly accessible, shareable by other parts of the organization, even by members of what I often have been calling the extended enterprise. So you've got critical suppliers, partners, even customers can benefit from that information, and trying to share that securely in on-prem systems can be much more difficult than if you can open up a door to certain segments of your cloud content management.
So looking forward, what's something that excites you about the next 10 years, something you've seen or that you really can't wait to see that we as an industry get it right?
It sounds a little bit crazy, but this concept of knowledge management has come roaring back with a vengeance in the customer calls I've had over the last few months. And I've referred to this as kind of information FOMO, that fear of missing out, because they know this stuff exists. They just don't know how to get to it, where it resides. And I think the opportunity to kind of mine into multiple systems, structured or unstructured, it really kind of opens up the door to new ways of knowledge delivery to people who are really thirsting for insights. The thing that terrifies me also is this area of digital preservation. And John, I know you've been talking about this, but I just think that we are underestimating the fragility of a lot of our digital artifacts. Are we going to be able to look at this, preserve it, access it in 10, 15, 50 years down the road? This is my historian hat coming back out. But also even things, tactical like link rot, right? We rely on online information so often. We embed links in our email and our documents. And, there's some data out there that shows if you look at scientific legal journals, a third of that is already dead links. So we really need to think about this stuff.
I think we're quickly heading down a path where you've got embedded and wearable devices and so forth, not just me wearing one on my wrist, but much more interesting use cases there. Elon Musk and many of the other leaders in the industry are looking at brain interfaces to computers and so forth. So being able to interact in new ways, whether it's voice, whether it's something wearable, whether it's something implantable, and then having access to all that information, I think that's going to just completely change again the way things work.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you very much for joining us here today. Once again, I'd like to also thank John Mancini.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Cheryl McKinnon and Ian Story. Up next, we're going to turn our attention to Microsoft's partners, specifically RecordPoint. So we're joined here today by Erica Tully and Anthony Woodward. Thanks for sitting down with us.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Yeah, glad to be here.
So can you tell our audience a little bit about who you are, what do you do at RecordPoint, and how did you get into this wonderful career?
Hi, everyone out there. I'm Anthony Woodward. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at RecordPoint, one of the founders. I came into this career through a kind of working in a law firm with kind of a legal background, doing a bunch of discovery and processes around managing documents and looking at how information is processed. And through that life cycle, kind of fell into how to then manage information better with different companies and worked with a bunch of companies. And you can tell from my accent, originally in Australia. And then more recently, looking at that on a global scale, looking at things, records and life cycle associated with that. And I was invited way back in the mid-2000s to be part of the MOREC 2010 committee that was looking at the European record standards, and then made some contributions to some of the ISO standards, and then kind of fell into records as a result of that. We've sort of then been building out my career, I suppose, a bunch of thinking around how you manage information more effectively. And I know Erica has a big bonus on top of that.
So Erica, could you take a moment to introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, hey, I'm Erica Tully, product evangelist for RecordPoint, also covering product marketing.
And even though we don't want to break your news for you, you are also most recently named
a Microsoft MVP for Office Apps and Services.
Congratulations. Yay. A wonderful addition to the community, not only because you already were, but now with the official stamp. You must now listen to me. I am an MVP. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And I think it's fascinating that for someone, I've known you for years. What our audience may not know is you also have a background in music and music festivals and organizing all sorts of things which are records from a different source. So I think it's interesting that you're now looking at a different meaning of the word record.
From vinyl to digital. I like it.
I had never thought of that, but you were absolutely right.
I interrupted you so rudely as you were starting to describe RecordPoint and what your mission is for your customers who are frequently and often our customers as well. Can you talk a little bit about RecordPoint?
Yeah, so I think most of the listeners to the podcast will be familiar with the rapid pace of technology innovation that's going on right now. So it just doesn't make sense to build a records management system inside another technology platform anymore. What makes more sense is to separate out your system of records or records management and your system of engagement, which is where people are doing their work every day, so that you can connect or disconnect from different systems of engagement or collaboration systems as needed, but still have your system of record to keep track of these records for compliance purposes.
What do you think has been the hardest thing, mostly in people's minds? I always think of records management, obviously, from a SharePoint perspective. Oh, you can't do that in the cloud, or you weren't able to do it in the cloud for some time. But what's the actual essence of what's tough about records management when people think about using it in the cloud?
Yeah, I think the hard thing for most people to get their heads around is, what does the cloud look like long term? Because records, particularly paper records that have been sitting in people's offices and in manila folders, have been sitting there for potentially even hundreds of years. And so they're trying to envisage, what does that cloud look like? How will I access it in 100 years' time? How will that information be auditable and accessible and known? And it's those kinds of issues they're grappling with in the cloud. It's really looking at how can I ensure the content and the authenticity of that content.
It's hard to talk about this without the most obvious question, remembering that not everyone in our audience is a compliance specialist. Mm-hmm. So what is a record?
Can I give you the long academic answer first, and then we'll drill into that and unpack it, if you like? The very simple definition is that a record is something that represents a business transaction and really represents the fullty of that transaction. So be that, that we've got a health issue in our organization and we want to capture that everybody was poisoned at lunch. That's a business transaction. We need to keep that information because there was poisoning. People might have died. They at least probably went to the doctor. We've got to keep that for some time that event occurred because we want to know that something's not systematic. And it's a really simple business transaction. We had lunch. We got poisoned. We all went to the doctor. We now need to capture that.
So now, now I know.
You guys just had lunch. How are you feeling?
I was just about to say, am I starting to look green, or what's going on here? I feel okay.
But that's it's a flippant one, but it's a business transaction. We had this transaction together. So A record is something that represents that. It could be, the leftover pieces from lunch that we now went and did some studies on. It could be the documents that resulted from us going to the doctor. It could be the group claim we had for having the day off. Those are all records in their own right. What you then need to look at is, and where it gets more tricky is, let's say that lunch event happened 4 or 5 times through the year. So we had, the first one happens, it's probably just a 7-year record. We just need to know it occurred, people had some time off, they were sick at lunch. But if it's systematic, and we see that this keeps occurring through the year, and we've got this problem in the cafeteria, well, now we've got something that needs to actually be kept longer. And it's these kind of events that make something a record. So individually, the pieces of that record, the lunch we ate and it's the studies associated with that and the report we get around the biology of that might in one instance be very simple, but it actually correlates to this much bigger event. So it's not an easy answer to what a business transaction is because, as you can see, you have to look at the linkages between these information pieces to establish what a record is.
So there is the record itself, whether that's a document, an instance, a descriptor of something. Mm-hmm. There's also then what has been done to that record. How was it used? Who was it shared with? Who was it sent to? Was it changed? Was it versioned, year over year, blah, blah, blah? How do you think about the metadata side of a record, being that it's a part of the record, but how do you think of the metadata side of things?
Yeah, and let's go back to that lunch example. That metadata creates those relationships. So to decide that there are these 4 events in the cafeteria over the year, it's the metadata that's going to create that linkage in the main. And so that metadata is going to describe who that person is, what role they are in the organization, what context they have for acting on that record. Because the biology report itself of, what was in the luncheon that we all got Giardia or something, that is very limited in its information set. It's who it went to, how they processed that, and how they interacted with it, which actually is more interesting to the business transaction. It's that usage that often proves or disproves particular events in courts. Dates and times are really important. People are really important on those events.
I've spoken to organizations where the concept of a record is fuzzy, and it is fuzzy, where it gets internally interpreted as a record is something important. Everything I do is important, ergo, everything I do is a record. How do you coach people away from that methodology? Why wouldn't something be a record?
Well, what decision did you make using that information?
Right.
That's what I would. That's ultimately what it comes down to.
And I mean, also on a practical basis, once something is declared to be a record, it is locked down and becomes. There's other schemas that you can bring forward, but in the simplest parlance, it's something that then becomes locked down and unchangeable. So you have these high-velocity collaborative processes and the idea of a permanent record, and it's the balance, I think, that we need to make sure we're striking.
I'd be careful with the word lockdown versus immutable, just to pick that up a little bit, but we can drill into that in a minute.
Can you tease that out for us a little bit?
So lockdown to me means that we're going to limit the interactivity on that record, and that's not how it works in the real world. So in the real world, again, if we can go back to our doctor's certificate, it's going to go through a few different life cycles. We get it from the doctor, we have it in email, and now we're going to send it on to our HR department and validate that. So it's not locked. We've got lots of people we want to share it with, but it needs to be immutable. The one that the certificate I got from the doctor must be a true representation of that particular certificate. It shouldn't be forged, it shouldn't be faked, it shouldn't be changed. So it's immutable in that it is that the certified copy, if you will, or the original of that context, but it may get different metadata on it. It may even change in the workflow because of those different applications we just talked about. It goes into a leave process, it gets approved, etc. So there's a difference between immutability and lockdown in my parlance.
So SharePoint 2010 SharePoint 2007 was the first version that had a record flag.
It's the first version of RecordPoint came with SharePoint 2007.
What's interesting is what you're touching on is the idea that a record should still stay in the ordinary course of user interactivity for many uses. SharePoint 2007 was based on the idea that I'm going to take something which is now a record and make it a record by moving it to a records repository, the Record Center. And that's a pattern that we still support. And then in 2010, and definitely in the cloud with labeling, we are much more focused on the preferred pattern being record in place. How do you decide when to let people keep using a record and when to hide it so no one can ever find it again other than the compliance team?
Yeah. Again, going back to that lunch example, let's assume that over lunch we prepared some notes of a meeting we were going to have later. Now, that happened at lunch, but it's not relevant to the lunch event of getting sick. And I think people get confused between something that is within the business transaction versus something that is of the business transaction, if that makes sense. And so making that decision, and this is where it does get tricky, around what documents form records and therefore require immutability and at what stage they require immutability versus what is just some notes or some supporting material that we use. And a lot of content is just supporting material that then forms up that. And we only really need records that represent the business transaction. We don't necessarily need all those notes and supporting materials and the slides we didn't show. None of those are part of the record. It's just those business transactions.
When somebody comes to you and says, we would like to store our records in a better way, whether that's in the cloud or on premises, can you take us through what you would tell them as far as here is the journey we're going to take you through so that we can put together a good record center or a records management process? And if you can throw on top of that, just at the tail end or in the middle of it, the part that you would then apply both, what is there out of the box and what RecordPoint adds on top.
Yeah, I think the first thing to keep in mind is that a records management system that is lightly designed and used is way better than a records management system that's way over-designed and perfect that nobody uses. So as you plan your project, kind of keep that in mind. And the second is, how do people actually do their work every day? Because you need to, first and foremost, not be impeding that. Records management, as much as we'd like it to be, is not more important than people doing their everyday work to those people. And I think in order to really be successful, you need to not have the end users have them do as little as possible. It'd be great if they would fill out all the metadata, but they might not do that. And they might not remember to move a document to somewhere else when the life cycle's over. So keeping those two things in mind, that's how I would plan my architecture for the records management system. But then where a tool like RecordPoint could come in is we actually don't care about your information architecture. We can work with anything. We're more concerned about capturing and scanning all the documents and then classifying those that should be records appropriately and then preserving those according to the retention schedule.
Are two huge emerging technologies that have a tremendous impact on this area potentially. How do you see records management and compliance being impacted?
Anthony's favorite subject.
Yeah. Look, a couple of things, and you can read my blogs if you haven't already online, and there's a bunch of thinking we've been doing in this area. But let's start with machine learning because it's the easiest to unpack. Blockchain gets a little bit more tricky. Clearly, identifying what is or isn't a record, what represents a business transaction expressed through those relationships and metadata is something AI is becoming very good at. So we can determine, what is really just a set of notes, a series of supporting materials, and we can start to determine automatically what represents that business transaction. So that's the first phase, and certainly at RecordPoint we've been doing a bunch of R&D there, and we've got some beta pieces out with our customers now who are very kindly testing that. The next phase is really then that categorization phase. So we talked a little bit, Erica touched on it earlier, around what is a good records capability and what do you have to think about. Well, one of the things you have to think about a lot is what are the retention schedules? How long do we keep different buckets of information? What is that category? What's the taxonomy that relates to? Because it's not normally the same taxonomy as, say, your site structure or even your IA in SharePoint. It tends to be a lot larger and more business-wide. So the AI can really help in automatically classifying material and capturing that taxonomy and making sure the data is mapped to that taxonomy and that retentioning. And then the last stage, I think, is to also look at the evolution of content over time. So today, we might have a series of records that we think are really important. We had a building, it was constructed, we're going to keep that for 25 years after the building's deconstructed. But in 10 years' time, maybe that context changes. And the AI can be aware of that context. And it might say, okay, we thought it was going to be 25 years after deconstruction, But they actually found there was a really large gas tank at the bottom of the building when they deconstructed it, and now it needs, from environmental reasons, to be held even longer. So the AI can be aware of these kind of external events and then change that data dynamically. And it's that last one that's really interesting to us. We're looking at that now where these other events occur in other systems that change the context of that data. So at Record Point, we've really been looking at those kind of three levels quite deeply.
It's something we talk about at the AIIM councils, that in 20 years, records management, absolutely here to stay and growing. Records managers are probably going to be dealing with training and exception processing.
Yeah, I think also, though, you still need people to explain the taxonomy and the algorithm. And I think the challenge to records managers is they get the taxonomy, they get retention schedules and how things are classified and how they're archived. They don't yet understand the algorithms, and some do, sorry, but as an industry, it's on its way to improving to understand the algorithm. So the big challenge, I think, for an AIIM member, myself, and part of the records community is really to make sure they have a better understanding of the algorithms and what they mean and what a K-gram really is and what's a neural network and what all these pieces actually come together and do.
So there's been a lot of discussion about taking that model of systems of engagement and systems of record and blurring it, because rather than have two completely disconnected areas, why not have engagement and record happening in the same environment? At the same time, it seems that we just have more systems than ever before. Do you think we're moving to a single repository world ever?
No.
Well, yeah, I wish it was as simple as no. I think it's a fallacy to probably think about repositories anymore. So the notion of single or multi isn't what matters. It's what does that system represent in terms of my business process?
Interesting.
And its application. And then when you start to think about that, it's, well, what are the control mechanisms of that workflow that are required, and therefore what records come out of it? So it's not really about, and this is how people think now, right? You go to your phone, I don't think about where that's stored in the cloud. Is that in Azure? Is it in Amazon? Does that sit in Google? I don't really care, right? What I care is that, my personal calendar syncs with my real calendar. It comes from different sources, and then as an application, I can use it. So my thinking is more about how do we make it application-centric rather than repository-centric.
So what are some of the customer worries that you hear about the most in this whole space, not even just in records management, but in compliance in general? You're much closer to talking to the customers on a day-to-day basis.
When I speak to records managers specifically, it's that the rate of change is happening so fast. How do I stay on top of it? What does the future of my job look like? What do I do when these new repositories are being introduced to my company? Because I think they're still thinking like with that repository approach rather than the application-centric way of thinking. And how do I keep up with the rapid pace of information being created?
How do you think of not the repository of the amount of content, but when you start working at scale, one business, many businesses, if you think about the cloud, obviously managed on behalf of many, many customers, what does it mean, records management at scale, kind of the good and bad of it? And are things maybe we should learn from, and maybe the things that you would attribute to your customers to think about?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to start to think about what is the risk profile of different types of data and what does a risky piece of content look like, and then how do we manage that appropriately through records management or information management and governance? Also, where does the value lie in the information? There are certain things you might want to keep for historical purposes as a record because they're historically meaningful or because they have a lot of intrinsic value for some reason.
I do think there's the potential here, done right, to take the value of information that is beginning in a compliance domain or even a compliance silo, and whether we have explicit or inferred metadata against it, the fact that something is a declared record should probably also, to your point, like that should tell us I might want to pay more attention to that in search than the 52 other drafts that were bouncing around before. Even if the graph has told us, there were 1,500 transactions on all of these drafts and they're going to be ranked fairly high, even if people aren't co-authoring the final version, the fact that I've got a flag on it is meaningful.
It's really interesting. I've been saying we're doing this work on AI, and we've been using the graph really heavily in our AI work, obviously. But we found the executed final version, the one with the signature on it often, doesn't come up in the graph because very few people collaborate on it.
Interesting.
So generally that very last version where the lawyers or even the people that are just part of it, it's kind of it's that final thing, that last person gets it, they make this final version. It's probably someone's executive assistant in the data we've seen. No one else touches it because it goes off somewhere in a room, gets signed, gets reattached as a sign scan or electronically, and it's done. And then there may even be further versions from that because that can often happen as well. But the graph can sometimes give some very misleading signals around records. And so that's something we've been looking at quite hard.
Yeah, I can't help but think, and this may be kind of just off topic, but a really good knowledge management center could be this record center that you're describing in the future. If it's recorded right, it's got the right AI properties, which of course is attached to the graph and search. The result coming back off of that would be something that's safe and secure and does protect the record, but actually could be very usable in the context of like a knowledge management center. How off is that thinking, or is that something that might even be something that paves a future of what does records management mean? It's not just the last mile, but it's actually more integrated in the collaborative space.
Yeah, and that's certainly our vision, and certainly but you're articulating that we see the industry going very much down that route where there is this content of higher value. And you can then consume that alongside your other value. It's one of those other application spaces like I was talking about before where I have a place to search things that represent the business transaction to come back to that definition. And it's then this knowledge center of vitality. I don't know if you've seen that rolling around in the records community. So this kind of idea that there are things that are more vital than others in information sets. And, you then have this kind of, I can do a knowledge search across everything. So whatever we've got in our corpus, or I can do it in the vital area. And it's really breaking those things apart. But it's just another metadata flag. It's not necessarily another repository. So I guess we really see that as just a state that content has, as opposed to really this other place I go.
So in content services into the future, besides what we've talked about with AI and blockchain and some of the things that Microsoft is doing, where do you see this really going?
I mean, I think it's just going to be mostly a frame of mind and mental shift rather than maybe a technology shift, and getting people to think about records not as things that are organized in a library system in pieces of paper that you can find later, but expanding the definition to be things that are still a collaborative work in progress, things that do have that higher value for whatever reason. And then the idea that there's not these walls of data anymore, that you can access all repositories from that one central application.
And if I can probably bring back some technology stuff to that, we sort of touched on blockchain, and I didn't actually answer the question that Chris asked. The blockchain capability is really to create better immutability, and that really, and again, we've done some research in that area, but I think there's a little bit further to go before blockchain can be used effectively in that space. I know there's been some articles written, and again, we have some blog posts about that. But the application of that could be very interesting. And I think, again, if you treat the blockchain as really another piece of metadata, linking the chain to the content, and therefore this series, so go back to our worn-out suggestion around lunch, that there's a series of documents that represent that event. And that series then belongs in the chain. What we see is this kind of capability where common pieces of information exist within a records graph. So this notion of having another graph that sits beyond the graph that represents the record and represents these business transactions within that relationship. So understanding what the workflow was, who the user's context is, and then why that was immutable within that event. So what was that event that caused that? And it's probably that record graph that's most interesting. And that's where kind of the chain fits in and the AI fits in, and you've got this fuller capability. And then that gives the records manager today out in the real world the ability to really query information, slice and dice that information, add real value to that information back to their organization.
Terrific.
Excellent. So we thank you for recording your point of view and providing a little insight into what you guys do, what you offer through RecordPoint.
So where can people go to learn more about each of you?
Recordpoint.com. You can find Anthony and I on there as well. That's where we both blog. And then I'm at Erica Telly on all the social media properties.
I'm at Woodwa on Twitter, which is probably where I hang out the most. Generally, you can find me on LinkedIn and kind of standard places.
And we'll make sure we get your blog into the show notes. So if you're interested in learning more about RecordPoint or the wonderful record musings of Anthony Woodward, we'll send you to the right place. We hope you can stick around. We're going to do our FAQ in a little while.
Terrific. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
It is time for frequently asked questions. We will start with Erica. What is your most frequently asked question and the most important thing? And we'll have it on record for all time. Your answer.
I get asked, are the records management features of SharePoint still available in the cloud? So the technical answer is yes, you can still use content types and term sets and put things in a record center. But the path forward that I think Microsoft has gone on record saying was going to be the Office 365 unified labels with Azure Information Protection labels and Advanced Data Governance labels. So if you're starting from scratch, definitely use those. But if you have invested heavily in SharePoint records management, then it was announced at Ignite that you'll be able to use the content types and metadata to inform and build labels. So you're not losing that investment.
We love frequently asked questions that are yes and. Yes and. So thank you for adding that to our FAQ record. Anthony, what's your most frequently asked question?
Yeah, look, it's a similar in theme, but coming from a different headspace, I guess, that I get asked all the time, can SharePoint, and by extension Office 365, do records? People that come from Documentum, OpenText, all these kind of what I describe as legacy tools, still see the application of how they manage information as quite different to how SharePoint and Office 365 manages information. So the answer is obviously yes. There's definitely that capability there. But there's some caveats. There's some caveats around things like cold documents, and you need to rethink about how document sets map to aggregations and file containers. And you need to explain that all the features you had in Documentum are available in Office 365 and in SharePoint, but there's just a slight tweaking to how you see the world. And once you understand that tweaking, you can see the marrying up and the relationship between those capabilities. But I often get asked that all the time by people in the records community.
Well, we thank you both for not only providing your FAQ today, but also addressing those questions when people ask you. I'm assuming in your speeches, on your blogs, everywhere, obviously on behalf of Microsoft, we thank you for being both expert and being willing to provide that information to the community. I'm going to go a little on record, off record, to talk about what is my most frequently asked question recently. And because we just published a blog talking about all the new web parts and all the fun stuff that we're bringing that sort of add to the toolbox experience for people to build out their pages, which may or may not become records in the future. A common question a lot of IT people are asking is, can I actually manage what web parts show up to my end user? And I think we have a 2/3 yes answer and a 1/3 no. The 2/3 yes is if you create custom web parts, you, of course, can control which ones of those show up or don't show up across different site collections and site experiences. We just released a feature, though, for admins to be able to, via PowerShell, run a quick script that actually removes all of the web parts that connect to external feed type things like the Twitter web part, our Kindle web part, which is the most important web part, the Kindle web part. But if anything pulls a feed of information outside of Office 365 your tenant, you can turn those things off. The last third, which just rounds out the answer, is there are first-party web parts that do focus on information that is technically inside the firewall of the cloud. And those currently today you can't adjust. But there's a lot that you can do to manage what web parts show up. And certainly if you build them yourselves, you can control how they work if they show up at all. So that's me going on record, off of Record Center stuff.
Ian, what's a question you've been hearing about lately as you've been talking with our customers?
Yeah, I would say, again, it kind of goes back to the scalability thing. People just wondering, hey, is it finally time that Microsoft is really ready to take on these workloads, things that we've been trying to move from on-prem repositories or third parties? Is it time? And I think unequivocally the answer is yes. Take advantage of the fact that your organization has Office 365 or you're thinking about going to Office 365 and leverage SharePoint to replace some of those very, very costly legacy tools that you have on premise, and leverage OneDrive to replace some of those consumer file sync and share tools that you have floating around the organization that are maybe kind of shadow IT or something like that. We're absolutely ready for it. We're ready to scale. We've really improved the sharing experience like we talked about earlier in the show, the sync experience, all the integration points on the desktop and in the Office apps, and have best-in-class mobile apps and so forth. So yeah, we're ready, and you should use this as a great way to simplify your life if you're in IT, to improve your productivity if you're a user, to improve your compliance and so forth if you're in governance. It's time to do that.
One question I've been getting a lot lately is from the perspective of a customer who says, IT hasn't opted into all of the advanced data governance capabilities about records management, but I want to be better about doing more in Office 365 than just using it as a document warehouse.
Mm-hmm. Just using it like a file share. Yep.
And that question keeps coming up a lot, where you have motivated and technically savvy business users. Mm-hmm. And the guidance I give them is, it's not quite shadow IT, but just using what's available to you as a user of Office 365, you can accomplish most of the same goals. You can make sure that your content is experienced through OneDrive. You can bring it into SharePoint libraries. You can use things like attention views to manage it at scale and be able to enrich it with metadata, and also to pay attention to flow. There's a lot that you can do to build structured processes as an end user to get approvals on documents and be able to collect more information just using flow.
Yep, and you can even start to do some basic classification and so forth, even if your organization hasn't gone down the advanced data governance path yet, and you're still just know that it's going to come. At some point, they're going to say, hey, we need to classify this content and put some retention on it and so forth. You can make your life easier as a user by getting started now and putting a little bit of metadata out there and, just organizing things a little bit, getting all your content consolidated so you don't have it spewed across your My Documents and your C drive and all kinds of network drives and so forth. You can start to consolidate it for yourself. You'll make yourself more productive, and you'll be ready for when the time comes and you need to do more of this data governance stuff.
Terrific.
Upcoming events, so many upcoming events. Welcome to 2019. Let's get you informed on upcoming events. First, with SharePoint Saturdays, these are exceptional opportunities for users and IT to learn from and engage with their local community. They're free, and I swear to you, they are worth the short drive, the walk, maybe even a plane hop to go to. So, January 11th in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
The home of the first SharePoint Saturday ever.
Ooh, that's some good trivia.
Yes.
All right, log that into your brain. Maybe at the end of 2019, we'll ask, what was the first
10
one?
years ago, 2009.
Awesome. Then jump to January 19th in both San Diego, California, and in St. Louis, Missouri. Great events. Visit spsevents.org to find an upcoming SharePoint Saturday near you.
Also coming up closer to mid-year, our biggest SharePoint-focused event.
Huge!
SharePoint Conference 2019, May 21st through 23rd at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas. We work on that along with the SharePoint Conference team. There will be over 150 speakers, hundreds of sessions, dozens of workshops, hundreds of our partners and exhibitors on the expo floor, and of course, all of the news and announcements that we've been dying to share with you since Ignite. It'll be time to take the wraps off of it and let you know what everyone's been working on. All the news and announcements led by Jeff Teeper in the keynote throughout the week. Everything that we've been developing for the past 6 months, we get to take the wraps off of it. If you want to learn more, we'd encourage you to register. Registration is open now at sharepointna.com.
And if you want to engage with Microsoft beyond SharePoint Saturday, beyond the SharePoint conference, there is also a broader conference that's taking all of the Ignite content from SharePoint, Office 365, Azure, and beyond, and we're putting that all in a box, and it's called Ignite the Tour. If you visit www.microsoft.com/Ignite the Tour, you'll see all the cities listed. There's about 17 cities throughout the year. Starting off the year on January 10th is Toronto. Then in January 16th is in Singapore, January 22nd in Tel Aviv, and January 31st in Milan. These are events that are filled with a ton of content, a lot of speakers flying from Redmond and beyond to come and share all the information that we exposed at Ignite, and then to put that and make sure that it lands and is something that if you have questions you can follow up with. A lot of great training, very localized. Ignite the Tour.
Next month, the week of February 11th, our old conference friend, SP TechCon, returns to Austin, Texas. Learn more at www.sptechcon.com. And as Ian Story and I were discussing, the global conference for all things content services, the AIIM conference, is coming up in March 26th to 28th in San Diego. A great place to wrap up your winter, soak up some sun, and learn the latest from Microsoft, along with other partners and industry luminaries. You can learn more at aimconference.com.
The last thing that we wanted to highlight was the SharePoint Fest is going to be in Washington, D.C., April 29th through May 3rd, and you can register at their site, sharepointfest.com/DC. Lots of events in 2019. Get your engine started to join in, train, and share back to the community.
We'll get all these events into the show notes. And of course, to learn more, just visit us in the Microsoft Tech community for a full roster of all the events coming for the year. Well, that's a wrap on another episode of the IntraZone. Very special thanks to our guests, Ian Storey, John Mancini, Cheryl McKinnon, Erica Tully, and Anthony Woodward.
We learned a lot about content services. We learned that it's not just ECM of the past, but it's content services going forward, which is inclusive of content management. And there's a lot to look forward to in the near future about the changes in knowledge management and delivery, and you heard it from the experts.
And we're hoping to do another episode in another 6 or 12 months because there'll be even more news to share after we get through this year's SPC and this year's Ignite.
That's impossible. There can't be any more content services. You've done it all.
But wait, there's more. We encourage you to visit our show page for resources and links to everything we discussed today. Go to aka.ms/theintrazone.
We have a survey that we'd love you to fill out at aka.ms/intrazone survey. You can also reach us via email at theintrazone@microsoft.com or via Twitter at SharePoint, at mcashman, and at cmcnulty2000. Thank you again for listening.
And of course, Mark, thank you. 2018 has been fantastic. It's been a lot of fun getting to be your co-host on this, and I can't wait to see where we take the podcast. Of course, special thanks out to our production team. We couldn't do it without you folks.
We are your hosts, Mark Cashman and Chris McNulty, and this has been The IntraZone, a show about the SharePoint Intelligent Intranet.